Billionaire visits her son's grave and finds a black waitress crying with a child. She was choked. The autumn wind cut across the marble headstones, rattling the dry leaves like whispers of forgotten souls. Eleanor Wallace, a billionaire whose face graced every magazine cover, whose name commanded respect in every boardroom, walked slowly toward her son's grave. Her heels clicked against the cobblestone path, echoing a silence only cemeteries carry. She wasn't here as the untouchable business mogul the world knew. She was here as a grieving mother, broken and human, clutching white roses, trembling in her hand. But as she approached, her heart skipped. Someone else was already there. A young black woman, dressed in the worn uniform of a diner waitress, knelt at the grave, her hands covering her face as tears streamed down. Beside her, a little boy tugged at her sleeve, confused, hungry, whispering, "Mama, why are you crying again?" Eleanor froze. Shock rippled through her chest. Why was this woman weeping at her son's grave? Why was a waitress, someone she didn't know, someone who shouldn't be here, crying as if she had lost the same thing Eleanor had? That moment would unravel Eleanor's entire understanding of her son, of her privilege, and of the invisible injustice that had always been around her, but never touched her, until now. Eleanor's first instinct was anger, sharp and immediate, the kind of fury that comes from a wound too raw to be touched. This was her son's resting place, her sacred ground, the one corner of the world where she allowed herself to be vulnerable, to see someone else, someone she didn't know, someone in a stained uniform, kneeling there, weeping as if she had lost the same thing, felt like trespass. Her grip tightened on the roses until the stems bent, thorns pressing into her skin. She wanted to shout, to demand the woman leave, to remind her that this marble headstone belonged to her family, not a stranger's grief. But she didn't. Something about the way the woman's shoulders shook held her back. Her eyes followed the small, frail boy at the woman's side. He was painfully thin, his shoes peeling at the edges, his jacket one size too small. He shifted from one foot to the other as though standing too long made him ache. He tugged at his mother's sleeve and whispered, "Mama, let's go, please. You're crying again." His voice was so soft it barely carried across the crisp air, but Eleanor heard every word. It cut through her anger like a knife. This wasn't a scene of disrespect. It was survival spilling out in front of her. She studied the woman more closely. Her hands rested against the grave, palms raw and cracked, nails chipped from long hours of work. The cheap polyester fabric of her uniform clung to her in the breeze, smelling faintly of coffee and grease. Eleanor recognized it for what it was, the uniform of someone invisible. Someone the wealthy glanced past without thought. Someone who could serve them food but not share their space. Yet here she was, pressing her forehead against the cold stone of Eleanor's son's grave, her tears dripping onto the grass below. Eleanor opened her mouth, but no words came. She wanted to ask why this woman was here, why she dared to shed tears at a grave she had no claim to. But something inside her shifted when their eyes finally met. The woman looked up slowly, as if gathering strength from the earth beneath her knees. Her face was streaked with tears, her lashes clumped together, her expression hollow yet unbroken. Her eyes locked with Eleanor's, and in them there was no fear, no shame, only a sorrow so vast it made Eleanor's throat tighten.
"You're his mother, aren't you?"
The woman's voice cracked as she spoke, barely louder than the wind. The question lingered in the air, heavy and trembling. Eleanor straightened her back, steadying herself against the weight of the moment. "Yes." She managed, her tone clipped, controlled, though her chest thudded with confusion. "Who are you? Why are you here?" The woman's lips trembled as though she had been holding back words for years. She lowered her gaze to the grave once more, her hand tightening around her son's fingers, as if bracing herself to finally release a truth Eleanor never expected to hear. The woman's name was Grace, and her voice carried the weary cadence of someone who had told her story too many times to strangers who never listened. She explained that she worked nights at a small diner on the edge of town, the kind of place where fluorescent lights buzzed overhead and the smell of fried oil seeped into her clothes, no matter how many times she washed them. Her shift stretched deep into the early hours when drunks stumbled in demanding coffee and college kids crowded booths, laughing too loudly over cheap fries. That was where Eleanor's son Matthew first appeared, quiet, reserved, sliding into a booth in the far corner as if he were trying to disappear from the world. Grace remembered him vividly. He never ordered much, sometimes just a black coffee, sometimes a slice of pie. What struck her wasn't what he ate, but how he treated her. Most customers ignored her unless they needed something, snapping their fingers or rolling their eyes if she was too slow. But Matthew spoke to her as if she were human, as if her presence mattered. He would ask how her shift was going, if she was holding up, if her boy was doing okay. At first, she thought it was politeness, but over time she realized he truly wanted to know. One night, near closing, the diner was almost empty. The neon sign outside flickered, and Grace was wiping down tables, her body aching from double shifts. She thought no one was watching when her hands began to shake. The bills were piling up. Her landlord had threatened eviction. Her son's school had called again, telling her he was struggling, falling behind. That night, the weight of it all broke her. She leaned against the counter and let the tears come, biting her lip to keep from sobbing out loud. Matthew had been sitting in his usual corner. He didn't pretend not to see her, didn't look away like others would have. Instead, he walked over and sat across from her at the counter. Grace tried to hide her face, embarrassed by her weakness, but he didn't let her retreat into silence. He ordered another slice of pie, one he never touched just so she wouldn't get in trouble for talking while on shift. Then, softly, he said words she never forgot. "You don't deserve this. None of it. You're stronger than they know." It wasn't pity in his voice. It wasn't the condescension she had heard so many times. It was recognition, as if he saw her for the first time, not as a waitress, not as a struggling single mother, but as a person who had been fighting battles no one else cared to see. Eleanor felt as if the ground had tilted beneath her. She had known her son was gentle, but hearing Grace's words made her realize just how much of him she had never seen. In her world, Matthew had always been the boy raised in privilege, the boy who never needed to worry about rent or hunger, who had tutors and travel and every opportunity at his fingertips. Yet Grace spoke of him as if he had been a lifeline, a quiet presence in the corner of a diner who noticed pain others overlooked. Eleanor's chest tightened with the thought that perhaps she hadn't understood her own child as deeply as a waitress working through the night had. She looked at Grace and the boy beside her, taking in their clothes, their tired eyes, the way they stood as if ready for the next blow life might deliver. Their world was miles away from Eleanor's towers of glass and marble, her manicured dinners, her circle of polished acquaintances. She had lived her entire life in a cocoon of safety, where problems could be solved with money, where a lawyer or a doctor was always a phone call away. Grace's life was something else entirely. Constant calculation, stretching every dollar, wondering if the next month would bring food shortages or eviction notices. And still, what cut Eleanor the deepest wasn't the differences. It was the shared weight of loss. The grave stood between them, binding them in grief neither wealth nor poverty could soften. Grace had lost someone who treated her with dignity, someone who gave her strength with words alone. Eleanor had lost her only child, the boy she had raised, the boy she thought she knew completely. The headstone bore only one name, but the achate mark belonged to them both. Her gaze shifted to the child again. His eyes were round and dark, carrying questions no child should have to hold inside. He studied Eleanor with cautious curiosity, not understanding why the rich woman with polished shoes and perfect hair seemed shaken by the sight of him. She saw the way he clung to his mother's hand, not just for comfort, but for reassurance that she was still standing, still able to fight another day. He was too young to understand injustice fully, but Eleanor recognized that he was already carrying it on his shoulders. For the first time in her life, Eleanor's wealth felt hollow, a useless shield. The credit cards, the estates, the business empire, all of it meant nothing in the face of this boy's quiet fear and Grace's cracked hands. What good was power when it couldn't bring back her son or erase the endless exhaustion etched into this woman's face? Grace's voice grew steadier as she spoke, though every word carried the weight of exhaustion. She told Eleanor about customers who snapped their fingers at her, who treated her like she was invisible until she made the smallest mistake. Then suddenly she was every insult they could hurl. She described nights when men mocked her accent, mimicked her voice, and left without tipping, laughing as though her dignity was theirs to shred. She spoke about how her son came home from school with questions she couldn't answer, why kids called him names, why teachers seemed quicker to punish him, why he was always the one blamed when fights broke out, even if he hadn't started them. Eleanor clenched her hands around her purse, fighting the urge to interrupt, to insist the world couldn't be that cruel. But she stayed silent, because the tremor in Grace's voice wasn't the sound of exaggeration. It was the sound of truth stripped bare. Grace spoke of landlords raising rent without notice, knowing she had no choice but to pay or leave. She spoke of walking home at night, clutching her keys like a weapon, her son at her side, praying no one followed too closely. Her eyes flickered toward Eleanor, sharp and weary. "You don't know what it's like," she said quietly, to break your back working, to scrub your hands raw, to give everything you can just to keep a roof overhead and still be treated like you're worth nothing. She swallowed hard, her jaw tightening. Your son, he never looked at me like that. Not once. The words dug deep into Eleanor's chest. She realized that her son had noticed things she had been too shielded to see. Matthew had walked into the same diner where she might have breezed past the staff without a glance, and he had seen something in Grace that Eleanor herself had never learned to look for: the quiet strength it takes to endure constant dismissal, the dignity in holding together a life when the world is stacked against you. Eleanor's throat burned with shame. She thought of all the times she had thrown charity galas, writing checks to causes she never truly understood, shaking hands with people who wore pain on their sleeves, but never listening long enough to feel it. Grace wasn't a statistic or a cause to donate to. She was a woman who carried invisible wounds every day, wounds Matthew had acknowledged in the simplest, most human way. The silence between them stretched, heavy but not hostile, as if both women were searching for air in the same suffocating grief. Eleanor slowly lifted the roses she had been holding, their white petals trembling from the tightness of her grip. She had intended to place them neatly at the base of the headstone, a private ritual she performed each visit, but something inside her shifted. She looked at Grace, saw the trembling of her hands, the way she clutched her son's fingers like he was the only anchor she had left in a storm that never ended. Without a word, Eleanor extended one of the roses toward her. Grace blinked, confused at first, her eyes darting between the flower and Eleanor's face. Her lips parted as if to refuse, as though taking anything from a woman like Eleanor felt like crossing a line that wasn't meant to be crossed. But the billionaire's hand remained steady, offering not charity, not pity, but inclusion. Grace reached out, hesitating, and her fingertips brushed the stem. When she finally closed her hand around the rose, her son's eyes widened as if he was witnessing something rare, something fragile. Together, they turned toward the grave. Eleanor crouched first, laying her flowers with practiced precision, while Grace followed beside her, lowering the single rose slowly, reverently, her hands shaking as though she were placing a piece of herself into the earth. For the briefest moment, their hands nearly touched, and Eleanor felt an unfamiliar warmth in her chest. The little boy, standing a step behind them, shifted uncertainly before kneeling too, his small fingers reaching out to trace the engraved letters of Matthew's name. His lips moved in a whisper Eleanor couldn't hear, but the tenderness in the gesture pierced her heart. She realized then that Matthew's kindness had not only touched Grace, but had left an imprint on this child as well, a boy who might carry his memory into a future Eleanor would never see. When they rose again, the distance between them seemed thinner. Eleanor no longer saw just a waitress and her child. She saw a mother trying to shield her boy from a world eager to crush him, the same way she had once tried to shield her son from his own battles. Grace, for her part, no longer looked at Eleanor as a woman untouchable in her wealth, but as another grieving mother who had been stripped of something irreplaceable. In that quiet exchange, without speeches or promises, the boundaries of race, class, and privilege blurred, leaving only the fragile bond of loss and the faint, trembling hope that compassion could outlive tragedy. As Eleanor walked away that evening, her mind replayed Grace's words over and over. She had come to mourn her son, but she left with a mirror held up to her soul. For the first time, she understood that grief and injustice were not separate. They were threads of the same cruel fabric, stitched into the lives of those society refuses to see. Grace returned to her shifts. Eleanor returned to her empire. But something had shifted. Eleanor began funding scholarships for children like Grace's boy. She began walking into places where billionaires rarely went, not with cameras or speeches, but with listening ears. Because now she knew silence was complicity. And as for Grace, she held her son's hand a little tighter, whispering Matthew's words into his ear whenever the world tried to crush him. You don't deserve this. You're stronger than they'll ever know. The grave remained silent, but the legacy of one young man's kindness echoed louder than death. In a world blinded by wealth, skin, and status, it was a reminder that what binds us isn't money, power, or privilege. It's humanity. And until we honor that, none of us are truly free.